In the scorching sands of 7th century Arabia, something impossible was about to unfold. Picture this: scattered desert tribes, outnumbered beyond belief, facing not one but two of history's mightiest empires simultaneously. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's legacy, commanded armies that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. The Sassanid Empire of Persia, with its legendary heavy cavalry and vast treasuries, had crushed countless foes across the ancient world. These were superpowers that had exhausted themselves fighting each other for generations, their borders stretching across continents, their military machines refined by centuries of conquest. Yet in less than 2 decades, both would crumble before warriors who emerged from the harsh wastelands they had always dismissed as worthless. This is the story of how the impossible became inevitable, how faith and fury combined with tactical brilliance to rewrite the map of the ancient world. What you're about to witness isn't just military history. It's the birth of an empire that would stretch from Spain to India, forged by men who turned the desert from a barrier into their greatest weapon. The year was 628, and the two greatest empires on earth had just finished tearing each other apart. For over 6 centuries, Rome and Persia had clashed across the borderlands of Syria and Mesopotamia. But this last war, the one historians call the final Great War of antiquity, had been different. More brutal, more devastating, more complete in its destruction than anything that had come before. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius had watched his empire nearly collapse as Persian armies swept through Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Jerusalem itself had fallen to the Sassanids, its churches burned, its Christian population scattered. For 14 years, the war had raged with unprecedented savagery. Cities were razed, populations enslaved, entire regions transformed into wastelands. The plague that historians call the Plague of Justinian had swept through both empires like a scythe through wheat, leaving behind a demographic catastrophe that would echo for generations. When the war finally ended with Byzantine victory, both empires stood victorious and defeated simultaneously. The Byzantines had reclaimed their lost territories, but at what cost? Their armies were shattered, their treasuries emptied, their populations decimated. Entire provinces lay in ruins, their fields untended, their cities hollow shells of their former glory. The great themes that had once provided the empire with its military backbone were broken, their farmer soldiers dead or displaced. The Sassanid Empire's condition was even more dire. The execution of Shah Khosrow II in 628 had unleashed a cascade of political chaos that would define the empire's final years. In the space of just 14 years, 12 different rulers would claim the throne. Generals murdered kings, provinces declared independence, and the central authority that had once commanded respect from the Indus to the Euphrates dissolved into competing factions. The Dejquans, the provincial landholders who formed the backbone of Sassanid administration, began carving out their own domains. The great fire temples that symbolized imperial unity fell into disrepair as local lords hoarded resources for their private armies. What had once been a unified empire became a patchwork of competing territories, each more concerned with local survival than imperial glory. Into this power vacuum stepped forces that neither empire had seriously considered as threats. The Arabian Peninsula, that harsh expanse of desert and oasis that both empires had largely ignored, was experiencing a transformation unlike anything in its history. Tribes that had spent generations raiding each other's camels and fighting over water rights were being united under a banner that combined spiritual conviction with military discipline. The message was simple yet revolutionary. There was one God, and Muhammad was his prophet. But the implications of this belief system extended far beyond theology. For the first time in Arabian history, the endless cycle of tribal warfare was being replaced by something unprecedented: unity of purpose, discipline of action, and a shared vision that looked beyond the traditional boundaries of desert life. The early Muslim community didn't initially set out to conquer empires. Their first military actions were defensive, protecting the nascent Islamic state from tribal confederations and Byzantine client kingdoms that sought to strangle this new movement in its cradle. But these early campaigns revealed something that would prove decisive in the years to come. The warriors of Arabia possessed military advantages that the great empires had never encountered. Their mobility was unmatched. While Byzantine and Persian armies moved like great, lumbering beasts, burdened by supply trains and heavy equipment. The Arab forces moved like the desert wind itself. They could strike where least expected, retreat when faced with superior numbers, and reappear where their enemies thought them impossible to reach. Their intimate knowledge of desert terrain turned what others saw as an impassable barrier into a highway for lightning raids and strategic repositioning. More importantly, they had developed a form of warfare perfectly adapted to their environment and their opponents' weaknesses. The great imperial armies had been designed to fight each other, to clash in massive set-piece battles where heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry decided the fate of campaigns. But the Arabs refused to fight by these rules. They would feign retreat, lure their enemies into unfavorable terrain, strike at supply lines, and disappear before retaliation could be organized. By 632, the Ridda Wars had demonstrated that this new military system could defeat not just traditional tribal opponents, but also the sophisticated forces sent by the great powers. When the last of the rebel tribes submitted to Medina, the architects of Islamic expansion realized they possessed something extraordinary, a military instrument capable of projecting power far beyond the traditional limits of Arabian influence. The first target was obvious. The Sassanid Empire's western provinces, weakened by decades of war and political chaos, offered the most promising avenue for expansion. The great fortress city of Hira, seat of the Lakhmid client kingdom that had long served as Persia's buffer against Arabian incursions, stood as the gateway to Mesopotamia. Its fall would announce to the world that a new power had emerged from the desert. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man who would become known as Sayf Allah al-Maslul, the drawn sword of God, was chosen to lead the assault. His reputation had been forged in the crucible of the Ridda Wars, where his tactical innovations had consistently defeated larger and better equipped forces. Now he would face his greatest test: the professional armies of an empire that had dominated the region for 4 centuries. The campaign began in 633, with a series of probing attacks that revealed just how vulnerable the Sassanid position had become. Local governors, lacking support from the chaos-racked capital, found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. These weren't the familiar tribal raiders of previous generations, content to strike and fade back into the desert. These were disciplined forces, united in purpose, capable of sustained operations far from their bases. At the Battle of Kazima, Khalid demonstrated the tactical revolution that would characterize the Arab conquests. Facing a larger Persian force commanded by Hormuz, he employed a double envelopment that Hannibal would have recognized. The Muslim center retreated in apparent disorder while the wings held firm, creating a crescent that drew the Persian cavalry deeper into the formation. At the crucial moment, hidden Arab cavalry struck both flanks simultaneously while the retreating center turned and attacked. The result was catastrophic for the Persians, with Hormuz himself falling in single combat against Khalid. But the true masterpiece came at the Battle of Ullais, forever remembered as the Battle of Chains. Here, Khalid faced a massive Persian army reinforced by Arab allies from the scattered tribes that still served the Sassanid crown. The battle's name came from the Persian decision to chain their front ranks together, preventing retreat and ensuring that their line would hold against Arab cavalry charges. It was exactly the wrong decision against exactly the wrong opponent. Khalid studied the chained formation with the calculating gaze of a master tactician. Where the Persians saw unbreakable resolve, he saw opportunity. The chains that were meant to prevent retreat would also prevent the tactical flexibility that might have saved them. He ordered his forces into a formation that would become legendary in military annals, a crescent that would engulf the enemy like a closing fist. The battle began at dawn, with the thunderous clash of steel on steel. Persian arrows darkened the sky, their iron points seeking Arab flesh with deadly precision. But the Arab warriors had learned to fight under such storms. Their shields locked together, their lines bent but never broke, and always they pressed forward with the relentless patience of men who knew their cause was just. For hours the melee raged, the chained Persian front rank holding firm against repeated Arab charges. Blood soaked into the sand beneath their feet, as warriors from both sides fell in heaps around the contested ground. The Persians fought with the desperate courage of men who knew retreat was impossible, while their Arab allies struck with the fury of desert raiders, protecting their ancient way of life. Then Khalid unleashed his masterstroke. While the Persian attention remained fixed on the frontal assault, Arab cavalry had been moving through the broken terrain on both flanks, invisible to the enemy commanders until the moment of impact. The charge came like thunder from a clear sky, Arab horsemen striking the Persian rear with devastating force, while their chained front line remained locked in combat, unable to turn and meet this new threat. The massacre that followed would be remembered for generations. Trapped between the Arab anvil and hammer, the Persian army disintegrated. The chains that had been meant to ensure victory became instruments of destruction as men died where they stood, unable to flee the carnage that surrounded them. The battlefield earned its grim nickname from the heaps of Persian dead, their bodies still linked by the iron bonds they had thought would bring them glory. Word of the disaster spread through the Sassanid Empire like wildfire. In the space of a single campaign season, the Arabs had shattered the military reputation that Persia had built over centuries. Provincial governors who had previously scorned the desert tribes now sent desperate messages to Ctesiphon, begging for reinforcements that the chaos-racked capital could not provide. But the Arabs were far from finished. Even as Khalid consolidated his conquests in Mesopotamia, another drama was unfolding along the Byzantine frontier. The Emperor Heraclius, despite his empire's exhaustion, recognized the mortal threat emerging from the south. Unlike the fractured Sassanids, Byzantium could still marshal formidable military resources when survival demanded it. The defense of Syria fell to some of the empire's most capable commanders. Theodore Trithyrius, the Sacellarios, commanded forces that had proven their worth in the long war against Persia. These weren't the demoralized garrison troops that had faced the Arabs in their early raids. These were professional soldiers, hardened by decades of frontier warfare, equipped with the finest weapons imperial workshops could produce. The Byzantine strategy was sound in concept. They would use their superior numbers and equipment to force the Arabs into decisive battles where mobility counted for less than raw combat power. Fortified cities would serve as anchors for their operations, denying the Arabs the swift victories that had characterized their Persian campaigns. Time, they believed, would work in their favor as the logistical challenges of operating far from Arabian bases took their toll on the invading forces. What they failed to understand was that the Arabs had evolved beyond simple raiding. The warriors who entered Syria in 634 were not the tribal fighters of previous generations. They were the veterans of the Iraqi campaigns, men who had learned to coordinate complex operations across vast distances, to maintain discipline under the most adverse conditions, to transform apparent defeat into stunning victory through tactical innovation. The siege of Damascus became a testing ground for both military systems. The city's massive walls, built to withstand the siege engines of classical antiquity, seemed to offer the Byzantines an impregnable fortress from which to coordinate their resistance. But the Arabs brought something new to the art of siege warfare, the willingness to think beyond conventional approaches. Rather than exhaust themselves in futile assaults against the walls, they divided their forces. Part of the army maintained the siege, preventing reinforcement or resupply, while the remainder ranged across the Syrian countryside, severing the road networks that connected Damascus to the rest of the empire. What had been intended as a fortress became a trap, its garrison slowly starving while Arab forces grew stronger with each passing day. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical siege. Syrian Christians, who had initially viewed the Arab invasion as a temporary disruption, began to question their loyalty to an empire that seemed incapable of protecting them. The religious differences between Monophysite Syria and Orthodox Constantinople, suppressed during the Persian crisis, resurged as local populations weighed the costs of continued resistance against the promises of Arab tolerance. When Damascus finally fell after a 6-month siege, its capture sent shockwaves through the entire Byzantine defensive system. The great fortress that was supposed to anchor imperial resistance had become just another Arab conquest, its fall proof that the traditional advantages of walls and position meant nothing against an enemy that refused to fight by established rules. The Emperor Heraclius, watching his Syrian defenses crumble piece by piece, made a fateful decision. Rather than continue to fight a war of attrition that was slowly bleeding his empire dry, he would gamble everything on a single massive offensive designed to crush the Arab forces before they could complete their conquest of Syria. The army he assembled represented the largest military effort Byzantium could mount, drawing troops from across the empire's remaining territories. This was to be the decisive battle that would determine whether the Arab conquests would continue or whether the ancient order would reassert itself through superior numbers and imperial discipline. The fate of empires hung in the balance as both forces converged on a fateful plain that would soon be remembered as one of history's greatest battlefields. The plain of Yarmouk stretched before both armies like a stage set for the gods themselves. Here, where the Jordan River carved its ancient path through the landscape, Emperor Heraclius had chosen to make his stand. The terrain seemed to favor the Byzantines with its open ground perfect for their heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry formations. But Khalid ibn al-Walid, fresh from his triumphs in Iraq, saw something entirely different as he surveyed the battlefield. To the untrained eye, Yarmouk appeared to offer the Byzantines every advantage they could desire. Their army numbered perhaps 80,000 men, a massive host that included the finest troops the empire could muster. Armenian heavy cavalry, their armor gleaming in the morning sun, formed ranks alongside seasoned Greek infantry who had learned their trade in the brutal campaigns against Persia. Arab auxiliary units, still loyal to their Byzantine paymasters, provided crucial knowledge of desert warfare tactics. The Byzantine commander, Vahan, was no mere courtier elevated beyond his abilities. He was a veteran of countless frontier battles, a man who understood both the strengths of his forces and the challenges posed by this new enemy. His battle plan was methodical and sound, used superior numbers to pin the Arab forces in place, then unleashed devastating cavalry charges that would shatter their formation like waves against stone. But as dawn broke over the Yarmouk plain on that August morning in 636, the Byzantines faced an enemy that had transformed warfare itself. Khalid's army numbered perhaps half their strength, yet every man had been forged in the crucible of conquest. These were the veterans of Ullais and Damascus, warriors who had learned to fight not just with weapons, but with the very landscape itself. The Arab formation that took shape in the morning mist would have seemed familiar to any student of classical warfare, yet it contained innovations that would prove decisive. The center was anchored by infantry armed with long spears and protected by large shields, men who could hold their ground against the heaviest cavalry charge. But it was the wings that held Khalid's secret weapon, the mobile guard, elite cavalry units that could strike like lightning and vanish like smoke. The battle opened with the traditional exchange of arrows, clouds of shafts darkening the sky as both armies sought to weaken their opponents before the main engagement. Byzantine cataphracts, their horses protected by scale armor, prepared for the charge that had dominated battlefields for centuries. These were the shock troops that had broken Persian lines from Nisibis to Nineveh, riders whose very appearance struck fear into enemy ranks. The charge, when it came, was magnificent and terrible. The earth shook under thousands of hooves as the Byzantine heavy cavalry thundered across the plain, their lances leveled like a forest of steel. The Arab center braced for impact, shields locked together, spear points angled to catch the charging horses. The collision sent men flying, horses screaming, weapons shattering under the tremendous force of impact. For a moment, it seemed the Byzantine gamble would pay off. Their cavalry punched deep into the Arab formation, threatening to split Khalid's army in two. Vahan, watching from his command position, must have felt the familiar surge of victory as his troops pressed their advantage. This was how battles were supposed to unfold, how empires maintained their dominance through superior numbers and equipment. But Khalid had been waiting for exactly this moment. As the Byzantine cavalry committed themselves to their frontal assault, the Arab mobile guard struck like twin serpents against the enemy flanks. These weren't the ponderous charges of heavy cavalry, weighed down by armor and momentum. These were swift, precise strikes that exploited the gaps created by the Byzantine advance. The transformation was instantaneous and catastrophic. What had been a coordinated Byzantine assault became a confused melee as Arab cavalry carved through the supporting infantry. Units that had maintained perfect formation moments before found themselves isolated and surrounded, their officers cut down before they could reorganize their men. Worse still, the Arab auxiliaries who had served Byzantium faithfully began to waver. Faced with kinsmen who fought not for gold but for faith, many threw down their weapons and joined the forces they had been sent to fight. The defections spread like plague through the Byzantine ranks as unit after unit realized they were fighting not just Arabs, but fellow believers who offered them brotherhood instead of servitude. Vahan tried desperately to restore order, sending reserve units to plug the gaps in his formation. But Khalid's mobile guard refused to remain in one place long enough to be counted. They would strike, withdraw, reappear elsewhere, always keeping the Byzantine forces off balance and unable to bring their superior numbers to bear effectively. By midday, the battle had become a rout. The great Byzantine army that had marched north with such confidence was streaming back toward the Jordan River crossings in complete disorder. Men threw away shields and weapons in their desperate flight. Officers abandoned their commands to save their own lives, and the careful organization that had taken months to build dissolved in a matter of hours. The massacre at the river crossings would be remembered for generations. Arab cavalry harried the fleeing Byzantines all the way to the water's edge, cutting down thousands who had no chance to organize a proper defense. The Jordan ran red with imperial blood, as the survivors of one of history's greatest armies struggled to escape the consequences of their defeat. Heraclius himself, watching from Jerusalem as reports of the disaster reached him, is said to have cried out in anguish at the magnitude of the catastrophe. In a single day, the military power that had taken centuries to build lay shattered on a Syrian battlefield. More than 40,000 Byzantine soldiers were dead or captured, their weapons and armor now serving Arab masters. The psychological impact reached far beyond the immediate military consequences. Word of Yarmouk spread through both empires like wildfire, carrying a message that neither could ignore. The age of imperial dominance was ending, and a new power had risen from the desert to claim its place among the mighty. In Constantinople, panic gripped the court as advisors struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. How could the army that had defeated Persia be annihilated by desert nomads? How could centuries of military tradition and tactical superiority count for nothing against an enemy that seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare with every battle? The answer lay not in any single factor, but in the convergence of circumstances that had created the perfect storm. The Arabs fought with the unity of shared faith and the mobility of desert-born warriors. Their enemies, weakened by decades of mutual destruction, could no longer muster the resources or the will to resist effectively. Most crucially, the Arabs had learned to turn their supposed disadvantages into decisive strengths. Syria fell like dominoes after Yarmouk. City after city opened its gates to avoid the fate of those foolish enough to resist. Damascus, Homs, Aleppo, even ancient Antioch submitted to Arab rule with barely a fight. The great defensive system that had protected the Eastern Empire for centuries simply ceased to exist, leaving the heartland of Byzantium exposed to forces that grew stronger with each victory. But even as Syria collapsed, an even greater prize beckoned from the east. The Sassanid Empire, racked by civil war and political chaos, presented opportunities that dwarfed even the Byzantine conquests. The road to Ctesiphon lay open, and with it the chance to claim the wealth of ages that Persia had accumulated through centuries of dominance. The stage was set for the final act of imperial destruction, as Arab armies prepared to march on the ancient seats of Persian power. What had begun as raids from the desert margin was about to become the complete transformation of the ancient world's political order. The impossible was becoming inevitable, and empires that had seemed eternal were discovering that even the mightiest towers built on sand must eventually fall. The greatest prize in the known world lay exposed, like a jewel torn from its setting. Ctesiphon, the White Palace of the Sassanids, had stood for 4 centuries as the symbol of Persian might. Its soaring arches and golden domes had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the tribute of conquered kings, the endless processions of wealth flowing from India to the Mediterranean. Now it waited, almost defenseless, as Arab armies closed in from multiple directions. The Persian response to the approaching storm revealed just how completely their empire had fractured. Yazdegerd III, barely more than a boy when thrust onto the throne, commanded an empire that existed more in name than reality. His generals plotted against each other even as enemy forces carved up the realm piece by piece. Provincial governors hoarded resources for their own survival rather than contributing to any coordinated defense. At the Battle of al-Qadisiyyah, this dysfunction reached its catastrophic climax. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas led 30,000 Arab warriors against a Persian host that may have numbered 5 times as many. The sight should have filled any rational observer with confidence in Persian victory. Armored elephants trumpeted at the center of their formation, creatures of legend that had terrorized enemies from Alexander's time to the present. Behind them marched the Immortals, elite guards whose very name proclaimed their invincibility. And so the desert miracle reached its inevitable conclusion. In less than 20 years, scattered tribes had accomplished what no force in history had managed: the simultaneous destruction of both great empires that had dominated the ancient world for centuries. From the scorching sands of Arabia, warriors had emerged to shatter the military traditions of Rome and Persia, proving that tactical brilliance and unshakable faith could overcome any odds. The map of the known world lay redrawn by desert winds, and empires that had seemed eternal discovered that even the mightiest fortresses crumble when their foundations are built on sand.